Hello guys, welcome to Harry Reality Bender. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if the Goblins of Gringotts adopted Harry at age 6 and he mastered goblin magic to control the wizarding economy? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Audit. The letter had been sitting in Gornik's satchel for 3 days. It wasn't unusual for correspondence to wait. Goblins did not rush paperwork, and paperwork did not rush goblins. But this particular letter had the peculiar quality of making Gornik's left ear twitch every time he reached past it for something else, which was deeply irritating because Gornik prided himself on having ears that responded only to threats and opportunity, and he could not decide which category this fell into. The letter was from the Department of Vault Succession, and it concerned the Potter accounts. Technically, the audit was overdue by 4 years. The Potter family vault, Vault 687, primary holdings, secondary trust established under the Fleamont Potter estate, had been flagged for a living heir status confirmation in 1982. The war had created a backlog. Then the backlog had created bureaucratic inertia, which was the natural enemy of everything Gringotts stood for. So here it was, 1986, summer, the kind of grey English summer that made Gornik deeply grateful that his people had the good sense to build their world underground, and he had been assigned the Potter audit. He took the fleur to a place called Little Whinging, which told him everything he needed to know about the wizarding world's relationship with subtlety, and emerged in a pub called the Rusty Nail that smelled of stale beer and quiet desperation. He straightened his coat, deep green, brass buttons, the Gringotts seal embossed on the breast pocket, and stepped out into Privet Drive. It was aggressively normal. That was the only word for it. Every house was the same beige, every garden the same aggressive tidiness, every hedge cut to a height that suggested someone had measured it with a ruler and a deeply unsatisfied heart. Gornik walked the length of it with the unhurried gait of someone who owns several things more valuable than anything on this street and knew it. Number 4 was indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the particularly aggressive quality of its normalcy, as though it were trying harder than the others. There was a boy on the front lawn, maybe 8 or 9, large in the way that suggested he was never told no about seconds, kicking a football against the garden wall with mechanical repetitiveness. He stared at Gornik with his mouth open. Gornik ignored him and knocked on the door. The woman who answered had a neck like a giraffe and an expression like someone who had bitten into a lemon and decided to make it their entire personality. She looked at Gornik the way people looked at something they found on the bottom of their shoe, with distaste so automatic it had stopped requiring any real effort. "Whatever you're selling," she said. "I am not selling anything." Gornik reached into his satchel and produced a card, which he held up with 2 fingers. Gringotts embossed seal. His name. His title. Senior Auditor, Vault Succession and Estate Management. "I am here regarding the Potter accounts. I understand a Harry Potter resides at this address." Something happened to the woman's face. It didn't change exactly, it rearranged, the way furniture gets rearranged to hide a stain on the carpet. "He's not available," she said. "I didn't ask if he was available," Gornik said pleasantly. "I asked if he resides here. These are different questions. I am very good at asking the right questions. It is my profession. Yes. He's here. But whatever this is, it can wait. Petunia Desley, and I'll have you know my husband has important connections in the local council, Mrs. Desley," Gornik said, and the way he said it made her stop talking. "I represent Gringotts Bank. The Potter family vault contains assets that make your local council contact look like a particularly unambitious moth. I would like to speak with Harry Potter. I would like to do it now. And unless you would like me to flag this address in our records as obstructive to heir welfare, which triggers a full ministry audit of any financial dealings this household may have with the wizarding world, I suggest you step aside." There was a silence. Petunia Desley's mouth opened and closed twice. She stepped aside. The inside of number 4 was precisely as normal as the outside promised, which was to say it was a monument to the idea that if you arranged enough chinaware and family photographs and floral patterns in one space, it proved you were a decent person. Gornik noted the photographs. There were a great many of them, the large boy from the garden at various ages, in various sizes, like a timeline of someone being consistently overfed. There was a man with a walrus mustache and small eyes. There was Petunia Dursley at different points in her life, equally thin and equally unhappy in each of them. There was not a single photograph of anyone else. Gornik stood in the hallway and let the quiet of the house settle around him the way water settles in a container, finding its level. Goblins were, by nature and training, readers of spaces. A vault told you everything about its owner, how they valued, how they organized, what they kept and what they discarded. This house had a particular quality to its silence. It was the quiet of something being kept small. Where, Gornik said, turning to Petunia Dursley with a stillness that most humans found deeply unsettling, is the child. She pointed. He followed the direction of her finger and found himself looking at a door beneath the staircase. It was small, the kind of door that led to a broom cupboard, or a space for storing things you didn't want to look at. There was a lock on it. A bolt, sliding type, on the outside. He looked at the bolt for a long moment. Then he looked at Petunia Dursley. She had the grace to look away. Gornik crossed to the door in 4 steps, slid the bolt back with a sound like a clock ticking over to midnight, and opened it. The smell hit him first, the close, stale smell of a space that didn't have enough air and had learned to make do. Then the darkness, his eyes adjusting quickly because goblin eyes were built for deep places and dim light. Then the cot, narrow and low, pushed against one wall. A shelf with 3 books on it. A cardboard box with what appeared to be 1 change of clothes. A broken toy soldier missing an arm, standing at attention on the shelf anyway. And on the cot, very still in the way that children go still when they aren't sure what kind of trouble has arrived, a small boy. He was slight, not the slight of a child who was naturally slim, but the slight of a child who wasn't eating enough and whose body had quietly adjusted its expectations. His hair was dark and went in multiple directions at once, as though it had opinions. He wore glasses with tape on one hinge. He had his knees pulled up to his chest, and he was watching Gornik with enormous green eyes that were doing something very careful, measuring, assessing, waiting to see what kind of thing this was before deciding how to respond. There was a bruise on his left forearm in the yellow-green stage of healing, which meant it was at least a week old. Gornik had audited estates for 63 years. He had opened vaults that held the accumulated wealth of families going back 4 centuries. He had counted things that couldn't be counted, valued things that had never been assigned a number. He was very difficult to surprise. He stood in the door of that cupboard for 3 seconds, looking at Harry Potter, and then he made a decision. He had been making decisions for 63 years, and every good one had felt exactly like this, not a weighing of options but a recognition, a click, like a lock turning because it had finally met the right key. Harry Potter, he said, and his voice was gentler than he usually bothered to make it. The boy's chin came up. Yes. My name is Gornik. I am a goblin, and I work for Gringotts Bank. Your family has an account with us. He paused. A rather substantial one. The green eyes blinked. I have a family. The question landed in the cupboard and sat there. Behind Gornik, he heard Petunia Dursley make a small sound that might have been embarrassment or might have been something else entirely, and he did not turn around to find out which. You did, Gornik said carefully. Your parents passed away when you were very young. But their estate, their money, their property, their holdings, that has been waiting for you. Another pause. You didn't know. Aunt Petunia says my parents were, the boy stopped. Reconsidered. With the instinctive diplomacy of a child who had learned that certain sentences had consequences, he reframed, I don't know very much about them. Gornik looked at the broken toy soldier standing its post. He looked at the taped glasses. He looked at the bruise. Then he looked back at Petunia Dursley, who was hovering in the hallway with her arms crossed and her expression set to I can explain, and he made a second decision in quick succession, which was unusual for him and felt equally inevitable. Mrs. Dursley, he said, I will need to conduct a private conversation with your nephew. Please wait in another room. This is my house, and Gringotts is the house's bank. He let that sit for just a moment. Please wait in another room. She went. He heard the kitchen door close. Gornik lowered himself into the only available position, crouching, because there was no room to stand without his head hitting the stair above, and he looked at Harry Potter at eye level for the first time. Up close, the green eyes were extraordinary. He'd read that in the file somewhere, a note from the vault registry, eyes, mother's color, striking. Files never got things like that right. These weren't just a color. They were the eyes of someone who had been paying attention for 6 years with no one noticing, which was a very specific kind of intelligence. How old are you? Gornik asked. 6, Harry said. Nearly 6.5. Do you go to school? Not the same one as Dudley. A different one. He said it simply, without self-pity, as though it were just a fact about the world. The sky is blue. Water is wet. I go to a different school. And do they treat you well here? The question was almost unprofessional, by Goblin auditing standards. But Gornik asked it anyway. Harry Potter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the bolt on the outside of his door, the bolt that Gornik had slid back to get in, the bolt that could only be operated from the outside, meaning it existed not to keep things out of this cupboard but to keep the boy in it. He looked at the bolt, and then he looked back at Gornik, and he didn't say anything at all. That was answer enough. Gornik sat back on his heels and opened his satchel. He removed the Potter file, a thick, brass-bound folder with the Gringotts seal and 7 different enchantments on the clasp that prevented unauthorized access. He opened it on his knee and read for a moment, not because he needed to refresh his memory but because he was thinking, and goblins think better with their hands busy. The Potter estate was, as he had told Petunia Dursley, substantial. Vault 687 was the primary liquid holding, roughly 80,000 galleons in gold, coins, and negotiable instruments. But Vault 687 was just the day-to-day account. Below it, in the deep vaults where the old families kept things they didn't want easily reached, the Potters had holdings that had been accumulating for 2 centuries. Vault 92. The Ancestral Vault. Gornik had checked its inventory before he came, not because it was strictly necessary for a routine audit, but because something in the flagged status report had made his left ear twitch. Vault 92 contained, among other things, properties in 4 countries, a collection of rare magical texts, 2 heirlooms under Fidelius protection, significant shares in 3 Diagon Alley businesses, and, this was what had made his ear twitch, a sealed document marked Stewardship Agreement, countersigned Dumbledore, dated November 1, 1981. He had read that document last night, in his office, alone, with all 3 locks on the door. It was not, strictly speaking, illegal. Albus Dumbledore had been granted temporary stewardship of Harry Potter's person and placement, not his estate, specifically not his estate, there was language in there as deliberate as a blade, in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's fall. Temporary. There was that word. Temporary stewardship, pending the identification of suitable guardianship. That had been 1981. This was 1986. Gornik clicked the folder shut. What he was about to do existed in a gray space of goblin law that most goblins never needed to visit. The law of unclaimed debt, Karak Uarthim, in the old language, literally the weight of what is owed, held that any entity holding a Gringotts account, living or dead, whose designated heir could be demonstrated to be suffering material and physical deprivation while their assets sat unclaimed, created a debt to the bank itself. Not to the heir. To the bank. Gringotts was not a charity. But Gringotts was also something older and stranger than most humans understood, and one of the things it was, at its deepest constitutional level, was a guardian of worth. And worth was not only gold. The law had been invoked 4 times in recorded goblin history. Once in the 14th century. Once in 1692. Once in 1891. Gornik had read all 4 cases in preparation. None of them had involved a wizard child. That was fine. The law didn't specify. Harry, Gornick said, and the boy looked up sharply, probably because adults rarely used his name without it preceding something bad. I'd like to tell you some things about your family. About what they left you. And then I'd like to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if you think I might not like the answer. Harry nodded. Very slowly. Like someone who had learned that agreements required caution. Your parents were James and Lily Potter. Your father came from an old family, very old, by your world standards. Your mother was what wizards call Muggleborn, meaning she came from a non-magical family, but she was one of the most gifted witches in a generation. He watched Harry's face. The boy was listening with an intensity that was almost startling. They were killed by a very dangerous man when you were 1 year old. You survived. You should not have, by any conventional understanding. But you did. Why? Harry asked. That, Gornick said, is a question I've been asking since I opened your file, and I don't have a complete answer yet. He paused. What I do have is this: your parents left you a great deal. Not just money. A name. A legacy. A place in a world you've never been properly introduced to. He let that sink in for a moment. And the people who should have introduced you to it put you in this cupboard instead. The green eyes didn't widen dramatically. Harry Potter, at 6.5, had already learned not to show reactions until he knew what they cost. But something shifted in those eyes, a careful, watchful hope, the kind that had been disappointed before and wasn't sure it could survive being disappointed again. The question I want to ask you, Gornick said, and he made his voice as even as he could, which goblins found easier than most creatures because they didn't have the human habit of making their voices warm to soften difficult things, is whether you would like to come with me. Not today, there are things that need to be arranged. But soon. Come to Gringotts. See what your family left you. Meet, he paused, selecting the word carefully, different people. Harry looked at the door. At the bolt on the outside. Would I have to come back? He asked. No, Gornick said. Harry Potter thought about this for approximately 3 seconds. Yes, he said. I'd like that. Petunia Dursley did not take the news well, which Gornick had anticipated. Her husband Vernon, who arrived home at 5:30 to find a goblin in his kitchen and his wife making a sound like a kettle at full boil, took it significantly worse. He was a large man with a large voice and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his life encountered something he couldn't make go away by being louder than it. He tried this approach with Gornick. Gornick waited for him to finish, then placed a single document on the kitchen table. It was, by the dry standards of financial law, a masterpiece of precision. It cited the law of unclaimed debt in 3 separate subsections. It noted, with careful specificity, the existence of the bolt on the cupboard door. It itemized, and this was Gornick's favorite part, because itemization was an art form, the exact discrepancy between the Gringotts records showing that the Potter estate had been providing a stipend of 1,200 galleons per year to the Dursley household for Harry Potter's care and maintenance, and the observable material conditions of a 6-year-old child living in a cupboard with 3 books and a broken toy. 1,200 galleons a year. For 5 years. The Dursleys had been drawing on Harry's own inheritance to pay for the privilege of putting him in a cupboard. Gornick had found that discrepancy at 11:30 the night before. He had gone very still for a while. Then he had written 4 additional pages of documentation. Vernon Dursley read the first page and went the color of raw liver. Now see here, he began. The full contents of this document, Gornick said, will be filed with the Gringotts Oversight Board, the British Ministry of Magic, and, as a courtesy, since he appears to have arranged the original placement, a copy will be sent to Albus Dumbledore. He folded his hands on the table with the serenity of someone holding all the cards and knowing it. Unless you would prefer to facilitate a clean and amicable transfer of guardianship, in which case I will note in the record that you cooperated fully and the matter will be handled internally. Silence. Also, Gornik added, because there was one more thing and he believed in being thorough, the stipend payments will be halted effective immediately and the undocumented disbursements of the past 5 years will be repayable to the Potter estate with interest. Vernon Dursley opened his mouth again. Then he looked at Petunia. Petunia was looking at the table. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and she was doing something complicated with her face that Gornik didn't examine too closely, because he had the suspicious sense that it might be something human and real, and he found those harder to audit. How long, Vernon Dursley said, finally, from a much lower place in his register, before he'd need to, before you'd, 2 weeks, Gornik said. I'll return in 2 weeks with the formal transfer documentation. In the meantime, and here he looked at Vernon Dursley with an expression he'd been saving for the right moment, I will also be returning periodically to ensure the child's welfare. Unannounced. As is standard practice for estates under active review. He stood, collected his documents, and replaced them in his satchel. He moved to the kitchen door, paused, and turned back with the practiced timing of someone who had been delivering final lines for 6 decades. I'll see myself out. He knocked on the cupboard door on his way past. 3 sharp knocks, which was how you knocked when you were telling someone that you were leaving but would be back. Harry Potter, on the other side, knocked back twice. Which was either random or was an acknowledgement, and either way, Gornik thought as he walked back out onto Privet Drive and into the aggressive normality of the Surrey evening, it was the beginning of something. He came back in 2 weeks, as promised. He brought papers, and a Gringotts carriage, and an official witness named Brack who was 1200 years old and had witnessed more transfers of this type than he could accurately count. He also brought, in his coat pocket, a bar of good dark chocolate, which he had read that human children liked. He wasn't sure why he'd included that, precisely, but he'd included it anyway. Harry Potter was waiting at the front door when the carriage arrived. He had one small bag, almost comically small, for a child with an estate the size of the Potter holdings, and he was wearing the same taped glasses and the same hand-me-down clothes, but he was standing very straight and his eyes were already looking past the Dursleys and the garden and the aggressive normalcy of Privet Drive toward whatever came next. Petunia Dursley stood behind him in the doorway. She had something in her hand, a sealed envelope, which she held out to Harry with the awkward gesture of someone offering an apology they couldn't quite say out loud. From your mother, she said stiffly. She left it with me when she left it. It was meant for when you were older but, she stopped. Harry took the envelope carefully. He looked at the handwriting on the front, his name, in his mother's hand, written when he was a baby and she was still alive. He looked at it for a long moment, and something moved across his face that Gornik didn't try to name. Then he tucked it carefully into his bag, looked up, and walked to the carriage without looking back. Took you long enough, he said to Gornik. Gornik made a sound that goblins made when they were pleased but unwilling to admit it. He held out the chocolate bar. Harry looked at it. Then he looked at Gornik with the green eyes that never stopped measuring. What kind is it? Dark. 70%. Dudley only gets milk chocolate. Yes, well, Gornik said, Dudley doesn't have a vault. Harry Potter took the chocolate and got into the carriage, and that, Gornik thought as he climbed up behind him and felt the carriage lurch into motion, was that. Harry didn't say much during the ride. He ate the chocolate in small, deliberate pieces, the pieces of someone who wasn't used to having things and wanted to make them last, and he watched the world go by outside the carriage window with those measuring eyes. Brack sat in the opposite corner and slept, in the aggressive way that very old goblins slept, which involved snoring and periodic twitching but no actual reduction in alertness. Can I ask you something? Harry said, about 20 minutes in. Yes. Why did you come? Not why you came that first time, I mean the law reason you told my aunt. But why did you come? Gornik considered the question and its subtext. The subtext was, why did you care? I opened your file, he said, and it felt wrong. Goblins there is something in us that responds to things being out of balance. When worth is not distributed correctly. When accounts don't match what they should be. He paused. Your account was very wrong. Harry ate a piece of chocolate. Looked out the window. You said I could ask things, he said. I said you could ask one thing. You have now asked two. The second one was the real one. The first was just to see if you'd answer. Gornik looked at him sideways. You're 6, he said. 6.5, Harry said, without inflection, and turned back to the window. The London skyline appeared somewhere ahead of them, and Gornik watched Harry's eyes track to it with the focus of someone filing information away in a place they'd be able to find it later. He thought of the vault registry note, eyes, mother's color, striking, and decided that whoever wrote it had fundamentally failed to understand what they were looking at. These were not striking eyes because of their color. They were striking because behind them, very clearly, someone was home. Completely home. Paying full attention. He thought about what the wizarding world had been waiting 5 years for Harry Potter to become, the boy who survived, the symbol, the hope, the weapon, and he looked at this 6.5-year-old eating dark chocolate in precise pieces with spine-perfect posture developed from years of trying not to take up too much space, and he thought that the wizarding world had absolutely no idea what was coming. Gringotts at night was different from Gringotts in the day. During business hours it was all marble columns and hustle and the clink of coins and the roar of the carts on the rails below and the imperious efficiency of 100 goblins processing 1,000 transactions. But Gornik brought Harry in through a side entrance, after hours, and what Harry found was a place that breathed differently at night. Lower ceilings in the back corridors. Torchlight that was amber rather than white. Walls of old stone that had stories in their where, you could see where generations of goblin hands had smoothed the edges of doorways, where boots had worn shallow troughs in the floors. Harry walked through it with his eyes very wide and his mouth very nearly, not quite, but nearly, open. This is where you live, he said. Where we work. I live in the residential quarters, 2 levels down. Where you'll be, at least initially, will be in the guest wing on the 3rd level. Guest wing, Harry said, with the tone of someone to whom the concept of a room that was entirely his own was still slightly theoretical. Until the chief makes a more permanent arrangement. Harry stopped walking. The chief? Ragnarok. He oversees the entire bank. He also, Gornik paused, selected his words with the care of someone diffusing something. He is who you'll be meeting tonight. He wanted to see you before you were settled. Is he? Harry started, and then stopped, and then, in the voice of a child who had learned to be very careful about how they asked things that mattered, he said, is he going to decide whether I can stay? He has already decided whether you can stay, Gornik said. This meeting is for other purposes. What purposes? To see what you're like. Harry considered this. What should I be like? Yourself, Gornik said, a touch more sharply than he intended. That is not negotiable. Do not perform anything. Do not try to be anything you aren't. He will know. They always know. Something about that, the they always know, made Harry pull his shoulders back slightly. Apparently the prospect of being seen clearly was not frightening to him. Apparently it was almost a relief. Ragnarok's office was at the end of a corridor that got quieter and more serious the further you walked down it, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but waited, the quiet of a room that had made a great many large decisions. The door was black iron, unremarkable, which was itself remarkable because everything else on this level had some degree of ornamentation. Black iron. No handles. It opened when Gornik knocked in a specific pattern and stepped back. Inside was a room that held thousands of years of occupation comfortably, shelves floor to ceiling with bound records, a desk that had been old when the current century began, a fire in a low grate that burned green-blue rather than orange. At the desk sat Ragnarok, and he was not what Harry had been expecting, because nothing in his expression suggested that the arrival of a 6-year-old human child was anything other than a matter of business. He was old. Not the dramatic old of fairy tale illustrations, not bent and gnarled and alarming. The old of something dense. Compact. His face had the quality of stone that has been under a great deal of pressure for a very long time and has simply become more itself, more essential. He had dark eyes, very still, and hands that rested on the desk as though they had always been there. He looked at Harry for a long time. Harry looked back. Neither of them moved. "Sit," Ragnarok said eventually. There was only one chair in front of the desk, clearly positioned there before this meeting, because the alternative was that Ragnarok never had visitors, which felt plausible. Harry sat. He sat with the same careful posture, spine straight, feet not quite reaching the floor. He didn't swing them. He didn't fidget. "Your name," Ragnarok said. "Harry Potter." "Here," Ragnarok said, "it will be Harry. Potter is a name you carry. It is not one we use." A pause. "What is it you think is going to happen?" Ragnarok asked. Harry blinked. The question was direct, the kind of direct that wasn't unkind but also wasn't softened. It was a real question expecting a real answer, and Harry, who had been asked very few real questions by adults in his life, seemed to feel the difference. "I think," Harry said carefully, "that I'm going to live here. And learn things. And be somewhere different from before. Different from a cupboard." "Yes. And you want that?" "Yes." No hesitation. Ragnarok looked at him for another long moment. Then, with the precise economy of someone who did not waste motion, he reached into a drawer and placed a single object on the desk. A small stone, flat and dark, with a mark on it, a symbol that Harry didn't recognize yet, two intersecting lines with a circular element at their crossing. He pushed it across the desk. "Pick it up," Ragnarok said. Harry looked at the stone. Looked at Ragnarok. Picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, the fire in the grate went from green-blue to gold. Just for a second. Just a flash, the way a light comes on in a room where someone is home. Then it went back to green-blue. Ragnarok looked at the fire. Then back at Harry. "Interesting," he said, and nothing in his voice told Harry whether interesting was good or bad or simply true. Harry set the stone back on the desk. "What was that?" "A test," Ragnarok said. "Did I pass?" Ragnarok picked up the stone, turned it once in his fingers, and set it in a different drawer. "You produced a result," he said. "Whether it is a pass requires more information." He looked at Gornik, who was standing by the door. "He will take the guest quarters for now. The education question we will discuss tomorrow." Gornik nodded. Ragnarok looked back at Harry. There was something in his face now that hadn't been there before, not warmth exactly, because goblins found warmth inefficient, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The expression of someone who has opened a file they expected to be routine and found something worth their full attention. "Harry," Ragnarok said. "Sir. You are owed a great deal. By my count, by goblin count, which is more precise than the human kind, you are one of the most significantly indebted to individuals alive." He let that settle. "You will not be told what to do with that. You will not be told what you are supposed to become. You will be given the tools to become what you actually are. Whether that is enough, whether you use them, is yours alone." Harry Potter, 6.5 years old, with taped glasses and a bag with almost nothing in it and a letter in his mother's handwriting that he hadn't opened yet, sat in that chair in the oldest room in one of the oldest buildings in Wizarding Britain, and he looked at Ragnarok and he said, very quietly and very clearly, "That's all I needed." Ragnarok made the same sound Gornik had made in the carriage, the goblin sound of being satisfied while declining to show it. He picked up his pen and returned to his papers, which was dismissal, but the kind that didn't feel like being sent away. Gornik touched Harry's shoulder and walked him out. In the corridor, Harry stopped and looked back at the black iron door, now closed. "He's going to be he started. "Let's not rush the categories," Gornik said. "Right," Harry said. He nodded once, the way people nod when they've filed something important. Then he looked up at Gornik. My room has a proper door. With a handle on the inside. Harry Potter breathed out slowly. Okay, he said. Okay. They walked down the corridor together, into the amber torchlight, into the deep and living quiet of Gringotts, and behind them the green-blue fire burned in Ragnar's grate, and above them the whole weight of the old stone building sat on the old stone ground, solid and immovable, and for the first time in 6.5 years, Harry Potter was somewhere that locked from the inside. Chapter 2, Gold and Bone. The first thing Harry learned about goblin magic was that it didn't care about him. Human magic, wand magic, the kind he'd read about in the books Gornik brought him in his first week, was apparently quite personal. It responded to emotion, to intent, to the waver in your voice when you said the incantation. It was, in the way of most things designed by humans, fundamentally about the person casting it. Goblin magic was different. Goblin magic was older than the concept of a person. Grimtooth explained this on Harry's first morning of actual instruction, approximately 3 weeks after Harry arrived at Gringotts, sitting on a low stool in a room so deep underground that the silence had texture to it, not the silence of absence but the silence of deep bedrock, the silence of things that had been still for 1,000,000 years and had strong opinions about remaining that way. Grimtooth was the oldest goblin Harry had yet met, which was saying something because every goblin he'd met so far made him feel like he was standing in the middle of a geological formation. But Grimtooth was old in a different register entirely, the kind of old where age had compressed everything non-essential and left only the core, which in Grimtooth's case was a razor-edged intelligence and a deeply committed intolerance for wasted time. He was also approximately the size of a large dog, which Harry had spent 2 days trying not to find surprising before giving up and just finding it straightforwardly interesting. Kuruk, Grimtooth said, and the word sat in the air differently from regular words, heavier, with a quality like a coin landing flat on stone. Say it. Kuruk, Harry said. Again. Kuruk. You're saying it like a human says a foreign word. You're performing the sounds. Don't perform it. Mean it. Grimtooth tapped the stone table between them with one gnarled finger. What does it mean? What did I tell you it means? Wait, Harry said. Worth. Exchange. Not 3 things. One thing that has 3 faces. Like a coin, it has 2 sides and an edge, but it is still one coin. Grimtooth's dark eyes fixed on him with the quality of someone who was used to waiting for students to understand things and had developed an extremely comfortable relationship with waiting. When you say Kuruk, you are not naming a technique. You are making a statement of fact. You are saying, this has value, this has place, this belongs in the ledger of real things. Can you feel the difference? Harry thought about it properly, the way Grimtooth had already, in 3 weeks, trained him to think about things, not grabbing at the first answer but sitting with the question until it resolved itself into something true. He thought about the moment in Ragnar's office when he'd picked up the stone and the fire had gone gold. He hadn't tried to do that. He hadn't performed anything. It had simply happened because something in him had responded to something in the stone, a recognition, like 2 accounts that matched when you laid them side by side. It's not something you do, Harry said slowly. It's something you acknowledge. Grimtooth was quiet for a moment. Closer, he said, which from Grimtooth was practically a standing ovation. The days developed a structure that felt, for the first time in Harry's life, like something built for him specifically rather than something he was being fitted around. Mornings were Kuruk theory with Grimtooth. Afternoons were Goblin history, not the sanitized history that wizarding textbooks offered in their occasional condescending footnotes about the bank, but the real history, the long history, wars and treaties and the slow centuries of a people who had been told repeatedly that they were lesser and had consistently responded by outlasting everyone who said so. Evenings were usually his own. He spent a lot of them in the vault archives with whatever Gornik deemed relevant, reading by Goblin torchlight, and a growing number of them in Ragnar's office, not for any formal purpose, but because Ragnar often worked late and didn't tell Harry to leave, which Harry had decided counted as an invitation. They didn't talk much, those evenings. Ragnar worked. Harry read, or sometimes just sat. But occasionally Ragnar would look up from his papers and say something, a piece of context, a piece of history, something that connected one thing Harry was learning to something else, and Harry began to understand that these were lessons too, just delivered in a different mode. The mode of someone who respected you enough to let you sit in the room while they did real work, rather than constructing a child-appropriate version of the world for your benefit. It was the greatest gift anyone had given him, and neither of them ever mentioned it. The letter from his mother he kept in the inside pocket of the jacket Gringotts had provided, deep green, well made, with the kind of stitching that said it was meant to last rather than impress. He hadn't opened it. He wasn't ready. He understood, in the way he was beginning to understand things, that ready wasn't the same as brave, and that there was no rush. The letter had waited 6 years. It could wait a little longer. It was the goblin community's reaction to his presence that was more complicated than anyone had quite prepared him for. Gringotts housed, at any given time, roughly 300 goblins in its residential and working quarters. Some had families in the goblin settlements outside London. Some had been in the bank for so long that the bank was all they knew. They ranged from ancient Kuruk masters who had been old when the current building was new, to apprentice clerks barely into their first century. Not all of them were enthusiastic about a human child living in their halls. Harry knew this because goblin hearing was, relative to human hearing, extraordinary, and Harry's had sharpened in his first weeks in the deep quiet of the bank the way eyes sharpen in dim light. He caught snatches of conversation in corridors, around corners, in the brief pauses when he passed groups of older goblins and conversation changed texture. The words weren't always in English. But tone was universal, and Harry had been reading tone his entire life. Human child. Potter. Ragnar's indulgence. Not our way. He didn't flinch when he heard it. He'd heard worse. He kept walking, kept his spine straight, and he filed it away in the part of his mind he was developing for strategic information, which was growing considerably. The direct confrontations were rarer but more interesting. The first came 6 weeks in the corridor outside the lower archive. A goblin named Sharp Fong, older, middle-ranked, with the specific air of someone who had been important once and resented the ways time had redistributed that importance, stopped Harry with a hand on his arm. "You shouldn't be in the archives," Sharp Fong said. Not loudly. Flatly, with the confidence of someone stating an obvious truth. Harry looked at the hand on his arm. Looked at Sharp Fong. "Gornik authorized my access. Gornik is an auditor. He has jurisdiction over accounts." Sharp Fang's grip tightened slightly. "Not over who walks our halls." "That would be Ragnar," Harry said. "Would you like me to go ask him to clarify?" The grip loosened. "Not all the way, just enough to signal recalculation." "You don't belong here," Sharp Fong said, quieter now, which somehow made it more pointed. "Whatever Ragnar intends, you are human. You will always be human. There are things you can be taught and things you cannot be, and the gap between those two things is where you'll break." Harry looked at him for a moment. "Probably," he said. "Can I have my arm back?" Sharp Fong let go. Harry went into the archive. Inside, alone among the ledgers and the amber light, he sat down and breathed carefully for a minute, because whatever he'd shown Sharp Fong, the truth was that some of it had landed. Not the "you don't belong," that had the familiar quality of something he'd heard before and learned to metabolize. But the gap between things he could be taught and things he couldn't be, that one sat differently. He pulled out a ledger and opened it and stared at the columns of ancient figures, and he thought about what Grimtooth had said that morning about Kuruk not caring about the person casting it. About it being a recognition rather than a performance. What if he was, fundamentally, the wrong thing to do the recognizing? He sat with that question for 20 minutes. Then he put it in the same place he put Sharp Fang's grip on his arm and the condescension in the corridor conversations, which was a place he was building carefully, not a place to forget things, but a place to put things he wasn't ready to use yet. Then he went back to the ledger, because there was work to do. Grimtooth did not go easy on him. This became clear in the second month, when they moved from theory to practice. The first exercises in practical Kuruk were, as far as Harry could tell, entirely impossible. Grimtooth would place an object on the table, a rock, a piece of metal, a sealed leather pouch, and tell Harry to determine its value without touching it. Not its monetary value. Its actual value. What it was worth in the sense of what it meant, what it had been through, what it contained that was real. Harry stared at a rock for 45 minutes the first day. Nothing happened. He went back to his room that evening with a headache that started behind his eyes and ended somewhere at the base of his skull, the kind of headache that felt like working a muscle that had never been used. The second day was worse. The third day Grimtooth replaced the rock with a small coin, very old, worn nearly smooth, and said, less thinking. More listening. To the coin. To yourself. The coin is already saying what it has to say. You are making too much noise to hear it. Harry stared at the coin. Tried to make less noise internally, which was harder than it sounded because his brain had a strong preference for generating options and contingencies and observations. He kept trying to grab at something, kept reaching for the answer the way he'd grab at a falling glass. He stopped reaching. Sat with his hands in his lap. Let the coin be a coin on a table in a quiet room. And something, very faint, like a conversation heard through stone, suggested itself. A sense of weight that was more than physical. An impression of many hands, many transactions, something that had moved through the world for a very long time and accumulated meaning the way a riverbed accumulates stone. He couldn't put it into a number. But he could feel its age. Its history of being significant to people. It's old, Harry said. And it's been important to a lot of people. Not worth a lot in coins, maybe. But worth something else. Grimtooth reached across and picked up the coin. He looked at it. Looked at Harry. This coin, he said, was minted in the year 893. It passed through 17 pairs of goblin hands in its first century. It was present at the signing of the Second Goblin Human Accord of 1207, in the pocket of my grandfather's grandfather. He paused. You got approximately 2/3 of what there is to get. That is more than any student I have taught in their first month of practice. Harry blinked. Is that good? It means you are not hopeless, Grimtooth said, which was, it turned out, the warmest thing he said to anyone. By the end of the first year, Harry could walk into a vault and tell you within a reasonable margin what its primary contents were without opening it. By the end of the second year, he could tell you what the contents were worth, not just in galleons, but in the older and more complicated currency of obligation, history, and leverage. By his third year at Gringotts, just turned 9, he accidentally stopped a theft. It wasn't intentional. He was in the upper vaults doing an accompanied audit. He'd started sitting in on Gornick's work about 6 months prior, officially as an educational exercise, unofficially because Gornick had discovered that Harry's Kuruk sense was already more refined than most junior goblin auditors and there was no point not using it, when he felt something wrong. It was in the corridor outside Vault 341, which held the assets of a minor noble family called the Blackwells. The wrongness was faint, a sort of ledger dissonance, the feeling of an account that didn't reconcile, except applied to the physical space rather than a document. Like a note played slightly off-key. Gornick, Harry said. Gornick turned from where he was unsealing the vault access record. What? Something's not right with 341. Gornick looked at him. In 3 years, they had developed a shorthand that bypassed explanation. Gornick had learned to take Harry's instincts seriously, and Harry had learned that the appropriate response to being taken seriously was to be worth taking seriously. Gornick stepped back from the vault door and laid a hand flat against it. His expression changed. The wards, he said quietly. The wards on Vault 341 had been accessed within the previous 12 hours. Not opened, the vault itself was sealed correctly, no sign of forced entry. But the ward matrix had been touched, probed by something sophisticated looking for a weakness. If they'd come back the following night, when there was a scheduled gap in the patrol rotation, they might have found it. 12 minutes later there were 6 Goblin security officers in the corridor, the Blackwell account was frozen, and a trap had been set with the silent efficiency of an organization that had been protecting things for 1,000 years. The thief came back the following night. They caught him in the act. He was a wizard, mid-30s, employed by the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, which was a department that had just enough access to certain ministry records to know when families were distracted, when accounts were under review, when a gap in the patrol rotation might go unnoticed. He was not, it emerged, working alone. The investigation that followed, which Harry was allowed to observe, again unofficially, again because there was no point not using what was available, unwound a smuggling operation that had been running for 3 years and involved 4 ministry employees and a contact at a private vault management firm in Edinburgh. Ragnarok heard the full report in his office. After the senior security officers had filed out, he sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a man reviewing something at high speed. Then he looked at Harry, who was standing against the far wall where observers stood when they were not invited to have an opinion. "How did you know?" Ragnarok asked. "It felt wrong," Harry said. "Like the math didn't work. Not in numbers, just, like when you're adding a column and one of the entries is lying." The entry was lying, Ragnarok agreed. The ward perturbation was subtle enough that 3 experienced guards had passed it without noticing. He studied Harry with those still dark eyes. "You were there on a general audit rotation." "Yes." "You weren't looking for it." "No." Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "What did Grimtooth give you for your practical exercises this week?" "Metal identification." "He's more actions right the next chapter now." Chapter 3, The Letter. The leaky cauldron smelled like 50 years of spilled butterbeer and poorly managed expectations, which Harry noted as a data point about the wizarding world's relationship with maintenance. He followed Gornik through the low-ceilinged room with the easy unhurried walk he'd developed over 5 years of moving through spaces where he wasn't quite expected, and he watched the room watch him. It started before anyone recognized him. A goblin walking through the leaky cauldron on a weekday morning was unusual but not remarkable. Gringotts staff moved through here regularly, and the barman Tom had the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to have opinions about his customers. But Harry was not a goblin, which the room noticed, and then the room noticed his age, which was also unusual, and then somebody, a witch with a copy of the Daily Prophet at a corner table, did a slow and theatrical double-take that involved actually lowering her paper. The scar was visible. He hadn't covered it and hadn't thought about covering it, because the idea of hiding something about himself hadn't occurred to him as an option in some years. "Is that," she started. "Good morning," Harry said to her pleasantly, without breaking stride, and walked through into the back courtyard behind Gornik. The brick wall was already open. Gornik had tapped it on their way through, 3 bricks, the right sequence, a sound like a lock turning in a very old door, and Diagon Alley unfolded in front of Harry for the first time. He stopped. Not because it was overwhelming. Because it was real in a way that 5 years of reading about it hadn't prepared him for, the noise and color and smell of a place that ran on magic the way a city ran on electricity, every shop and sign and person part of a world that had been existing without him all this time. He stood in the entrance and took it in properly, the way he took things in, filing and measuring and notating. The apothecary. Madame Malkin's. Flourish and Blots. Ollivanders at the end of the alley, slightly apart from the rest. The ice cream parlor that didn't have a good reason to exist in September but existed anyway. And Gringotts. White marble, at the far end, massive, familiar from the inside, strange to see from the outside for the first time. The goblin guards at the entrance stood with a stillness Harry recognized as trained vigilance rather than decoration. "Well," Harry said. "You have 2 hours, Gornik said. Supplies list." He produced the Hogwarts list from his coat. "We'll do the books first. I want to see the vault." Gornik paused. "You've seen plenty of vaults." "I haven't seen mine." There was a beat. "Books first," Gornik said. Then the vault. Flourish and Blots was the kind of bookshop that had given up on organization as a philosophical position and committed instead to density, which Harry respected. He moved through it with the list in one hand and a secondary list in his head. The books on the official Hogwarts curriculum were the starting point. The question was what else was here that wasn't on the list but probably should be. He was pulling a history of magic from a shelf when someone ran into him from around the corner with enough force to knock the book sideways and send 2 other volumes cascading to the floor. He caught his own book, missed the other 2. "Oh, I'm so sorry, I wasn't. There are too many books in this aisle, really, it's completely impractical." The person attached to the voice was a girl his age, hair in a state of enthusiastic revolt, arms full of her own books, with the expression of someone who had been systematically working her way through a list and was mildly annoyed at the interruption to her system. She was also already bending to pick up the fallen books, scanning their spines as she did. "Magical Theory and the Bathilda Bagshot," she said. "Both on the first-year list, good choices." She straightened, looked at him. Her eyes went to the scar the way everyone's eyes went to the scar, a quick involuntary flick, and then, unusually, came directly back to his face. "I'm Hermione Granger. I'm Muggleborn, so I've been doing a lot of supplementary reading to catch up. I've actually read all the first-year textbooks already, have you?" Harry looked at her. At the stack of books in her arms. At the way she'd clocked the titles on the fallen volumes before she'd finished picking them up. "Most of them," he said. "Which ones?" "The core curriculum. I've had access to a wider library for the last 5 years, so, 5 years. Her eyes sharpened. "You've known about the wizarding world for 5 years? But you don't, you're not, your parents were magical, weren't they, so someone must have told you." "I grew up in Gringotts," Harry said. She blinked. "You grew up in the bank? It's larger than it looks from the front." She looked at him for a moment. He could see her recalibrating, not with suspicion, but with the specific delight of someone who had encountered a fact that didn't fit their existing model and found the discrepancy interesting rather than threatening. "That's extraordinary," she said. "What was it like?" "The goblin culture must be. I read a chapter about it in Magical Peoples of Britain, but it was honestly quite dismissive and I don't think the author had ever actually." Hermione. A woman's voice from 2 aisles over, harried, fond. "We need to get to Madame Malkin's before lunch." Hermione Granger looked momentarily frustrated by the existence of time as a constraint. She shifted her books to one arm and produced a small notebook from her pocket with the efficiency of someone who carried it specifically for moments like this. "What's your name?" she asked. Harry considered. It had been 5 years since anyone his age had asked him that without already knowing the answer. The expectation was usually already loaded into the question. "Harry," he said. She wrote it down. Not his last name, just Harry, because she'd only asked for what he'd said. "I'll see you at Hogwarts, Harry," she said, with the certainty of someone scheduling a meeting, and went to find her mother. Harry watched her go, then looked down at a history of magic in his hands. He opened it to a random page. The author's perspective on goblin contributions to magical development was, as Hermione had suggested, dismissive in the comfortable way of someone who'd never had to reckon with being wrong. He tucked it under his arm with the rest of his purchases and went to find Gornik. Vault 687 was not the deepest of the Potter holdings, but it was the most liquid, the working account, the day-to-day gold. The cart ride down was the same as it always was, the rails singing, the darkness rushing past, the vertiginous drops that still did something to his stomach despite 5 years of familiarity. The vault opened to his presence, not to a key, which most vaults required, but to the combination of a key and the physical proximity of the heir, which was how the old family accounts worked. The door swung and the light from inside spilled out the way vault light always did, and Harry stepped in. He'd been in dozens of vaults. Hundreds, if you counted accompanied audits and training exercises. He knew gold the way most people knew furniture, by its specific light, its weight in the air, the quality of silence a room full of it had. But this was his. He stood in the middle of it and looked at the stacks of galleons, the neat organization of an account that had been properly maintained for decades, and he felt the currach in it, the weight of what his family had accumulated and intended and meant, and he thought about his father coming from an old family and his mother finding the bones of the world and magic that most people never looked at, and he thought about the letter in his pocket. "You are owed a great deal, sweetheart. Collect it. Take what you need for Hogwarts," Gornik said from the doorway. "I know." Harry filled the pouch, practical amount, not ostentatious, enough to not think about money for a year and enough to have options. He picked up one additional thing, a small coin from the very back of the vault, old, worn, the kind that had been there since before the accounts had current managers. He held it for a moment, feeling its history, James Potter, and before him Fleamont, and before him a chain of people going back further than the current ministry. He pocketed it. "The deep vault," Harry said. "Vault 92. When can I access it?" Gornik was quiet for a half-beat. "When Ragnarok clears it." "Has he not? He will want to be present the first time." Harry nodded. That was reasonable. He filed it as a thing to address, not a barrier. They came back up through the shaft and into the marble lobby, and Harry was 3 steps out of the cart when he felt it, not with currach exactly, but with the instinct adjacent to it, the one that had caught the ward perturbation on Vault 341. The feeling of being observed with significant intent. He turned around. The man was standing at the teller's counter, completing what looked like routine business, tall, silver-haired, with a walking stick that was slightly too elegant to be a walking stick, in robes that cost more than the Dursley's house and carried themselves accordingly. He had the look of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his presence. He was looking at Harry with an expression so controlled it was itself a tell. The control was too perfect. That was the face of someone who had been surprised by something and was using every available resource not to show it. Harry had 5 years of reading goblin faces, which were considerably less expressive than human faces. He read this one in about 2 seconds. He held the man's gaze for a moment, not aggression, just acknowledgement, "I see you seeing me," and then turned and walked out with Gornik. "Who was that?" Harry asked, once they were back in the alley. Gornik's voice was carefully neutral. "Lucius Malfoy." Harry thought about what he knew about the Malfoy name, which was, after 5 years of vault records and goblin history and the political infrastructure of the wizarding world, quite a lot. The Malfoy vault was in the deep tier. Old money, old connections, and a history during Voldemort's ascent that the official record was careful about and the unofficial record was less careful about. "He was surprised to see me," Harry said. "He thought you were with the Dursleys," Gornik said. A great many people thought that. He had a very specific reaction. "Yes." Gornik's voice remained carefully neutral, but there was something underneath it. "He did." Harry filed Lucius Malfoy in his strategic information folder, which had been growing steadily since he was 7 and now occupied a significant portion of his mental architecture. He filed him not at the front, where immediate concerns lived, but in the middle tier, significant, worth monitoring, not yet an active problem. He had a feeling that would change. Madame Malkin's was efficient and slightly overwhelming, the robes came in multiples, the fittings were quick, the woman herself had the professional warmth of someone who dressed half the wizarding world and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. Harry stood on the fitting stool in the standard school robes and watched his reflection and thought that he looked like someone going somewhere, which was accurate. The boy on the stool next to him was blond, sharp-featured, with the posture of someone who had been told since birth that posture was a political statement. He was being fitted for what appeared to be significantly more expensive robes than the standard, and he was managing this with the casual ease of someone for whom expensive was the baseline. He looked at Harry in the mirror. "Hogwarts," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "First year." The tone was assessing rather than friendly, not unfriendly, just the tone of someone used to ranking everything. "I'm Draco Malfoy." Harry looked at him in the mirror. Lucius Malfoy's son, the resemblance was clear, the same controlled precision in the features, though without the adult weight of calculation behind it yet. Or the beginning of it, at least. Harry said. Draco's eyes went to the scar with the same involuntary flick as Hermione's, but where Hermione's gaze had returned to his face with curiosity, Draco's returned with something more like recalibration. A rapid and visible adjustment of whatever he'd expected this moment to be. Harry Potter, Draco said. I heard you were, he stopped. Started again. There are stories about where you've been. I imagine there are, Harry said pleasantly. You came from Gringotts. Draco's voice was carefully controlled, the way his father's had been in the bank lobby, but he was 11 and the control wasn't quite complete. The goblins have been, my father mentioned, I grew up there, Harry said, because the conversation was going to get to the truth eventually and there was no reason to delay the inevitable. Since I was 6. Draco Malfoy went through 3 expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been the beginning of alarm, though he shut it down too quickly to be sure. He was good for 11. Better than most adults, actually. Harry made a note. That's, Draco said, searching for the right word with the care of someone who understood that the right word was often a weapon, unusual. Very, Harry agreed. Madame Malkin pronounced them done and they stepped off their stools and Harry picked up his package and they stood in the cramped space of the shop in the particular way of 2 people who were not quite sure whether they were done talking or not. Your father was in the bank earlier, Harry said, because he was curious what the reaction would be. Draco's chin came up about 3 millimeters. He conducts business there regularly. I noticed. A beat. Draco looked at him with those sharp eyes, and Harry looked back, and for a moment they were both just doing the math. 2 11-year-olds, both political in ways their peers generally weren't yet, both aware that this conversation was happening on multiple levels simultaneously. I'll see you at school, Draco said finally, and his voice had shed the assessing quality. It was flatter now. More careful. You will, Harry said, and went out. Gornick was waiting on the pavement with the books and a look that said he'd been doing his own observing. Malfoy's son, Gornick said. He's sharp, Harry said. Sharp and raised to view things in a specific framework. Yes. Harry looked back at the shop. He's not stupid enough to ignore what he just saw, and he's too connected to his father's worldview to know what to do with it yet. He paused. He'll be a problem at some point. Not the way his father will be. A different kind of problem. Gornick looked at him sideways. You determined all that in a 5-minute fitting. For minutes, Harry said, and they walked down the alley toward Ollivander's. The wand-maker's shop had the specific quality of a place that was sure of itself, not tidy, not untidy, simply organized according to a principle that wasn't immediately obvious from the outside. The boxes stacked ceiling high with the dusty patience of things that had been waiting for their moment for a very long time. Harry stood in the narrow space between the shelves and felt something that wasn't quite correct but was adjacent to it, a roomful of objects that were all latent, all wound tight with potential, like a library of unread sentences. Ollivander himself emerged from somewhere in the back with the unhurried air of a man who understood that the wand chose the wizard and therefore the scheduling was out of his hands. He was old, not Grimtooth old, not ancient stone old, but old in the specific way of someone who had been paying very close attention for a very long time. His eyes went to the scar and then, unlike everyone else today, went directly and unapologetically to Harry's hands. Not his face. His hands. Mr. Potter, Ollivander said, and his voice had the quality of something being precisely measured. I wondered when I'd be seeing you. I would have come sooner, Harry said, but I wasn't enrolled until recently. Ollivander blinked, very slowly. Indeed. He moved to the shelves. Your father, Holly, 11 inches, mahogany, supple. Your mother, Willow, 10 1/4, swishy, excellent for charms. He tilted his head. Let's see what you are. The first 3 wands did nothing interesting. Harry could feel their responses as clearly as he could feel a vault's content, a sense of weight and worth and whether things matched, and none of them matched. Not wrong, exactly, just not right. Like a coin in the wrong column of the ledger. The fourth one, Ollivander handed him with a peculiar expression, the look of someone following a logic they hadn't expected. Holly and phoenix feather, Ollivander said. 11 inches. Curious companion for you, the brother wand gave you that scar. Harry closed his fingers around it. The warmth was immediate and specific, not a performance, not a flash of fireworks, but the quiet deep settling of something finding its proper place. He felt it the way he'd felt the coin in Ragnarok's office, the way he felt the value in an old object, a recognition, two things in the same ledger finally lined up. But it was also more than that, and the more was the strange part. Because under the warmth was something older, something that had the quality of Karuk but ran deeper than any exercise Grimtooth had given him. It felt like the fire going gold in Ragnarok's grate, like his mother's letter, like the accumulated weight of every person in the chain of his father's vault, like the answer to a question that had been asking itself since he was 1 year old in a crib in Godric's Hollow. Ollivander was watching him very carefully. Well, the old wand-maker said softly, that is, yes. That's quite something. It matches, Harry said. They always match, in the end, Ollivander said. But some matches are more interesting than others. He looked at Harry with those precise, ancient eyes. You feel it differently from most, don't you? Most wizards get a warmth, a sense of rightness. You're reading it. Is that unusual? Ollivander was quiet for a moment. I have been making wands for 9 decades, he said, and I have never had a customer describe the wand experience using the word matches. His head tilted fractionally. What are you, Mr. Potter, exactly? Harry said. And I'm working on a complete answer to that question. Ollivander smiled, thin and real. Come back when you have one. The conversation would be worth the time. He took the wand, boxed it, handed it over. 7 galleons. And do try not to lose it, that particular combination I won't see again. They were back in the leaky cauldron by early afternoon, eating lunch at a quiet table, when the conversation Harry had been half expecting happened. Gornick set his fork down with the deliberateness of someone transitioning topics. Dumbledore's owl arrived this morning, he said. Harry looked up. He knows, Gornick said. About you enrolling. Someone, possibly the Ministry, possibly Madame Malkin, possibly half of Diagon Alley, let him know that Harry Potter surfaced today. And? Gornick slid a folded piece of parchment across the table. Harry opened it and read it, which took 30 seconds because it was written in the looping, somewhat theatrical style of someone who had spent decades cultivating an image of benign wisdom. The letter expressed delight at Harry's enrollment, warmth about the long period of wondering where he'd been, a gentle inquiry about his accommodations, and an invitation to meet for tea at Hogwarts before term began, at Harry's convenience, whenever he felt comfortable. It was, Harry thought, extremely good. Every sentence was carefully positioned, the delight established that he was welcome, the wondering established that he'd been concerned rather than indifferent, the gentle inquiry was a probe for information wrapped in apparent care, and the at Harry's convenience gave the illusion of Harry controlling the meeting while making the meeting itself seem like an ordinary and warm invitation between equals. He writes well, Harry said. He's been writing things like this for 70 years, Gornick said. He is, professionally and personally, an expert at making decisions seem like your own. Harry folded the letter and set it beside his plate. He ate for a moment, thinking. I'm going to meet him, he said. Gornick's expression did not change. I thought you would. Not because he asked me to. Because I want to see what he does with me. Harry looked up. And I want to ask him something. What? Why he left me there. He said it simply, without heat, the way you state a fact you intend to verify. I want to hear what he says. Not to be angry about it, I'm genuinely curious what the explanation sounds like out loud. Gornick looked at him for a long moment. And if the explanation is compelling? Then it'll be compelling, Harry said. And I'll account for it. He picked up his fork. But I don't think it will be. He went to Hogwarts 3 days before term began, in the company of Gornik and a written authorization from Ragnarok that Gornik described as a legal document and Harry suspected was also a pointed political statement. The castle, seen from the lake approach, was the kind of building that declared its own history through sheer accumulated mass, not old the way Gringotts was old, but old in the way of a thing that had been argued over and loved and damaged and rebuilt and argued over again, and was still standing. Harry took it in from the boat with the same careful inventory he gave everything new, filing the towers, the light in the windows, the black lake, the sense of magic in the stones, not Karuk exactly, something different, something more chaotic and human and teeming. He respected it. Professor McGonagall met him at the entrance with the efficient warmth of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had decided that the professional response was to treat it as normal. She walked him through the entrance hall and up 2 staircases with the brisk purposefulness of someone who did not slow down for castle tours, which Harry appreciated. The headmaster's office was at the top of a spiral staircase behind a stone gargoyle. The staircase was moving, rotating gently like a slow helical gear, and Harry stepped onto it and rode it up and thought about what he knew about this room from 5 years of indirectly relevant documentation. Albus Dumbledore was standing at the window when Harry came in. He turned, and his expression was warm, and his eyes were kind behind the half-moon glasses, and everything about him suggested a man genuinely pleased to see a child he'd been worried about. Harry looked at him and took the measure of him the way he took the measure of everything, fully, without interference, letting the impression form without rushing to the conclusion. What he found was, extremely intelligent. Genuinely warm in a way that wasn't entirely performance. Accustomed to being the most capable person in the room and having his framing of situations accepted as the correct framing. Currently running, behind the warmth and the kind eyes, a very fast and very controlled assessment. Harry, Dumbledore said, and the way he said it had the quality of something long awaited. I am so very glad to see you. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited to, which was a small thing but deliberate, not rudeness, just the establishment of a basic fact. I sit when I choose to sit. Please, Dumbledore said, settling into his own chair with the ease of someone who had decided not to notice, call me Albus. Or Dumbledore, if you prefer. I've never been very attached to titles. A pause. Except Chief Warlock, which is admittedly very grand. Harry almost smiled. The self-deprecation was good, natural feeling, the kind of humor that made you like someone before you decided to. You wanted to see me, Harry said. I did. Dumbledore folded his hands on the desk. I have wanted to see you for some time, in truth. I want you to know that I was not indifferent to your situation, Harry. I thought about you a great deal. But you didn't come. A slight pause. Very slight. There were reasons why I believed you were safest where you were. Protections that your mother's sacrifice created, keyed to your blood relatives, did those protections require a bolt on the outside of a door? Harry asked. The question landed cleanly, without drama, and for a fraction of a second, a very small fraction, barely visible, something moved behind Dumbledore's eyes that was not part of the performance. Real discomfort. Real, genuine, uncomfortable knowledge that he'd made a choice that hurt a child and he was now in a room with that child discussing it. No, Dumbledore said quietly. They did not. Did the protections you designed require that my parents' estate fund my relative's household for 5 years while I had 3 books and a broken toy? Silence. No, Dumbledore said again. More quietly. So the bolt and the money, those were choices they made, Harry said, within the situation you created. And the situation you created, he paused, not for effect but because he was being precise, was designed to keep me accessible and off the map. Not for my safety. For your plans. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. What happened in his face was complicated, the warmth didn't disappear, but it shifted, became something more honest and therefore slightly more uncomfortable to look at. It was the face of someone having their own logic laid out in front of them with perfect accuracy and finding the view unexpectedly clarifying. "You are," Dumbledore said carefully, "remarkably perceptive for 11. "I've had good teachers," Harry said. "Who taught me that the world is made of accounts, and every account can be audited, and the most important thing you can do with a ledger is to look at what's actually there rather than what you expected to find." A long pause. The portraits on the walls had been paying close attention. A sleeping one in the far corner had stopped its snoring. The phoenix on the perch by the window made a low sound and turned its head toward Harry with that particular bird intelligence that paid no attention to human social navigation. "I made choices," Dumbledore said, "that I believed were necessary. I still believe the necessity was real, even if the execution caused harm I didn't adequately account for." His voice was genuine, Harry could tell, and it made the conversation harder and more interesting simultaneously. "The prophecy, Harry, I know about the prophecy," Harry said. Dumbledore stopped. "Trelawney's prophecy, made 1980, recorded and partially overheard by a man named Severus Snape who delivered it to Voldemort." Harry held Dumbledore's gaze. "Ragnarok has very complete records." The silence this time had a different quality, the quality of a very experienced, very intelligent man recalculating at high speed. "Then you understand," Dumbledore said slowly, "why I needed you. I understand why you wanted a Harry Potter who would come to you grateful and without context and ready to be guided," Harry said. "That Harry Potter grew up in a cupboard and didn't have Gringotts. This is who you actually got." He paused. "I'm not your enemy. I want to be very clear about that. Voldemort is a genuine problem and I have genuine reasons to want him gone that have nothing to do with your prophecy. But I'm not going to be moved around a board, and I'm not going to pretend this conversation didn't happen, and I'm not going to let you reframe it as something it isn't." Another pause. "Are we clear?" Dumbledore looked at him. And then, unexpectedly, something happened in his face that Harry hadn't anticipated. Something cracked open slightly, just for a moment, just enough to be real. Not defeat. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been very smart and very certain for a very long time, and has just encountered something that made them genuinely unsure. "We are clear," Dumbledore said. "Good." Harry stood. "I'm going to enjoy Hogwarts, I think. And if you want my cooperation on any future plans that involve me, you know where I am." He moved to the door. "Gringotts' hours are 9 to 5. Gornick handles my calendar." He was at the door when Dumbledore said, very quietly, "Your mother would have." Harry turned around. "I know," he said simply. "I have her letter." He went down the spiral staircase with the stone gargoyle closing behind him, into the cool castle air, and he walked back through the entrance hall and out to where Gornick was waiting by the lake with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of someone who had been waiting patiently and was not going to ask any questions. "Well?" Gornick said. "He's not going to be straightforward," Harry said. "But he's honest when he's cornered. That's something." He looked back at the castle. "He also genuinely cares, in his way. He's just managed to arrange it so that his caring always aligns with his plans." "The most dangerous kind," Gornick said. "The most useful kind," Harry said, "if you're careful." They walked back to the boats, and the evening came down over the lake, and somewhere in the castle behind them a phoenix made its rising sound, not distress, something else. Something like recognition. Platform 9 3/4 on September the 1st was organized chaos in the specific key of families saying goodbye, which was a key Harry had learned to listen to from the outside. He stood with Gornick on the platform with his trunk and his owl, a gift from Grim Tooth, who had presented the tawny owl with the same attitude as the belt knife, firmly not a gift, merely a practical arrangement, and watched the platform do what platforms did. Families everywhere. Parents adjusting robes and issuing last-minute instructions and hugging children who were simultaneously embarrassed and grateful. The Weasley family, he recognized them from Gringotts records, the bright red hair unmistakable, were a small contained chaos of their own, a mother managing several children simultaneously with the efficient love of someone who had long since stopped having adequate resources and was running on something better. He was looking for Hermione Granger and found her before she found him. She was standing with two people who were clearly her parents, mother-looking and slightly overwhelmed in the best possible way, the way of people who had accepted that their child was extraordinary and were just trying to keep up. Hermione herself had a book open even now, reading standing up, until her mother took it gently and put it in her bag. She looked up, scanning the platform with the systematic efficiency he'd already clocked as her default mode, and found him. She smiled, quick, genuine, no performance in it, and said something to her parents and came over with her cart, weaving through the crowd with the confidence of someone for whom obstacles were a navigational problem rather than a social one. "You're here," she said, with the tone of someone confirming a scheduled appointment. "I'm here," Harry agreed. She looked at Gornick. "You must be from Gringotts." Gornick said. "Senior auditor. It's wonderful to meet you. I've been reading about Goblin financial systems and I have about 40 questions, but I suspect now is not the time." "It is not," Gornick said, with something in his voice that Harry recognized as appreciation. Harry took his trunk and his owl, and he looked at Gornick, and for a moment neither of them said anything that was adequate to the occasion, which was fine because they both knew that the conversation they were having was not the one with words. "The deep vault," Harry said. "When you're home for Christmas," Gornick said. "Right." Harry looked at him. "Tell Grimtooth, he knows," Gornick said. "Tell Ragnarok, he knows too," Gornick said, a fraction more quietly. "Get on the train, Harry." Harry got on the train. The Hogwarts Express pulled away from the platform with a sound like something enormous beginning, and Harry sat in a compartment with Hermione Granger and watched the city give way to countryside and thought about everything that was coming, the castle, the people, the world that had been building a version of him for 10 years, and felt something he didn't have an exact word for yet. Not nervousness. Not excitement, quite. The feeling of an account about to open. Of a ledger about to be started. "You're not nervous," Hermione observed. "No," Harry said. She looked at him with those bright eyes. "Most people are nervous. Starting somewhere new, not knowing anyone." "I know you," Harry said. She blinked. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, and it was different from the quick platform smile. This one reached all the way up, the kind of smile that came from being seen unexpectedly. "I suppose you do," she said, and opened her book, and outside the window the English countryside rolled past in its complicated green, and the train carried them north toward whatever came next. Chapter 4, The Sorting of Accounts. The boats across the Black Lake at night were, Harry decided, a deliberate piece of theater. There was no functional reason to bring first-years across the water in the dark on small boats when there was presumably a perfectly serviceable road. It was designed to do exactly what it did, which was to give 11-year-olds their first view of Hogwarts from below and across the water, so that the castle came at them like something inevitable. Something that had been waiting. He appreciated the craftsmanship of it. The goblins would have called it investment architecture, spending money on how a thing felt to enter, because the feeling of entering set every interaction that followed. Hermione was in the boat next to his, talking to a red-haired boy she'd met on the train, Ron Weasley, from the family he'd spotted on the platform, with the specific combination of humor and insecurity that came from being the sixth child in a family of 7 and having to find your own frequency. Harry had spoken to him briefly on the train and found him quick-witted and generous and slightly overwhelmed by Harry's history in the way people were, though he recovered faster than most. On Harry's boat was a girl named Neville Longbottom, which he knew the second she said her name, because the Longbottom vault was in the mid-tier holdings and Frank and Alice Longbottom's names appeared in the same order of the Phoenix documentation as his parents, who was holding the sides of the boat with both hands and looking at the water with the expression of someone managing significant anxiety through determination alone. "It's quite deep," she said, not really to Harry but to the available air. "The giant squid is reportedly friendly," Harry said. Neville looked at him. "That's meant to be reassuring." "It's meant to be accurate. Reassurance would be telling you nothing lives in there." He paused. I don't think lying about facts is actually comforting to people who are paying attention. Neville looked at him for a moment, then, unexpectedly, laughed, a surprised sound, genuine. That's fair, actually. She looked back at the water. I'm Neville, by the way. Harry. Her eyes did the thing eyes did with the scar, and then she looked at the castle, and then she said, You grew up with goblins. That's what everyone on the train was saying. That's accurate. Is it? What's it like? They seem, she searched for words that weren't rude, very precise. They're precise about things that deserve precision, Harry said. Which is most things, honestly. The boat grounded against the far bank, and they climbed out and walked up the path toward the lit entrance where Professor McGonagall was waiting with the particular posture of someone who had done this 4 dozen times and still took it seriously. She walked them into the entrance hall and gave them a speech about houses and conduct and the sorting, and Harry listened and watched simultaneously, the other students, the castle itself, the quality of magic in the stones which was as different from Gringotts as a cathedral was from a bank. Both old. Both serious. Different shapes of serious. The waiting chamber was full of murmuring and barely suppressed nerves and the occasional sharp whisper about the sorting being a kind of test. Someone near the back was muttering about having to fight a troll. Harry stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the door to the great hall and felt the correct sense respond to the castle the same way it responded to a vault he hadn't opened yet. This contains things of significance, attend carefully. Draco Malfoy appeared at his elbow with the smooth movement of someone who had navigated toward him deliberately. Potter, he said. Malfoy, Harry said, because they'd arrived at last names apparently. Which house do you think you'll be in? Draco asked it casually, but the question was doing work. It was a probe for where Harry understood himself to be positioned, and a potential offer of alliance depending on the answer. I don't know yet, Harry said. Slytherin's the right choice for people with genuine ambition, Draco said, with the smoothness of a line that had been prepared. The other houses have their qualities, Harry said. I'll end up where I end up. The hat decides, not me. The hat can be influenced, Draco said. Harry looked at him sideways. 11 years old and already understanding that negotiations started before the stakes were visible. Lucius Malfoy's son, absolutely. I'll keep that in mind, Harry said pleasantly, and Draco couldn't tell from the pleasantness whether he'd made a point or not, which was precisely the intended effect. The doors opened. They walked in. The great hall was another piece of deliberate architecture, the ceiling bewitched to reflect the October night sky, 1,000 candles floating, for long tables full of watching faces, the staff table at the end with Dumbledore at the center of it like a man sitting naturally at the center of things. Harry walked through the doors with everyone else and felt the weight of 300 gazes in the specific way he felt the weight of things, not as pressure but as information. He caught Dumbledore's eyes across the hall. The headmaster gave him a small nod, warm, precise, the nod of a man who had decided to play a long game with full knowledge that Harry knew he was playing it. Harry nodded back, the same. The sorting hat was on a stool at the front of the hall. It was old and patched and had the specific quality of something that had been doing one job for 1,000 years and had strong opinions. When the hall quieted it opened what appeared to be its mouth and sang, and the song was genuinely good, not the content was a standard breakdown of house qualities, but the structure was smart, the rhymes were clean, and it had a hook. Harry noted this. Something that old and still interested in doing its job well was worth paying attention to. The alphabetical calling began. Hannah Abbott, Hufflepuff. Susan Bones, Hufflepuff. Terry Boot, Ravenclaw. The hall applauded each sorting with the house-specific enthusiasm of an audience that had picked its team. Harry stood in the remaining cluster of unsorted students and watched and thought about the houses as actual organizing systems rather than identities, Gryffindor's bravery, Hufflepuff's loyalty, Ravenclaw's learning, Slytherin's ambition, all of them accurate descriptions of emphases but none of them complete pictures of the people they shaped. Hermione Granger went to Ravenclaw. She sat down at the blue and bronze table and immediately looked back at Harry with an expression that said she thought this was correct and was pleased with the logic. Neville Longbottom, after a hat conversation that lasted nearly 2 minutes and involved Neville's expression going through visible argument, went to Gryffindor. Ron Weasley went to Gryffindor with the swift inevitability of someone in a long family tradition. Draco Malfoy went to Slytherin with the swift inevitability of someone in a different long family tradition. Then Professor McGonagall's voice, Potter, Harry. The hall went from the warm applause of Ron Weasley's sorting to a silence so complete you could have heard a galleon drop. Harry walked up to the stool with the same unhurried walk he used everywhere, sat, and put on the hat. Darkness, and then a voice in his ear that was like several voices at once, layered, the accumulated intelligence of 1,000 years of knowing every student who sat in this chair. Well, the hat said, and the word had a quality of genuine surprise in it. This is something I haven't encountered before. You've sorted thousands of students, Harry thought back. I have. And they all come in wearing what they are on the outside. The hat paused, which was interesting because he suspected the hat didn't pause often. You have layers. Not hidden layers, layers you've built deliberately. Like a vault. I've grown up in vaults. So I can feel. Another pause. The ambition would suit Slytherin, but it's not the petty kind, it's structural, long view, it doesn't need the house to validate itself. The intelligence would suit Ravenclaw, but you're not primarily a learner, you're a calculator. A weigher. The loyalty and hard-working quality would suit Hufflepuff, but that's not your primary engine either. A thoughtful quality. And Gryffindor, I'm not reckless, Harry thought. No. But you are brave. Just not in the way most Gryffindors are brave. They're brave in the moment, they feel fear and act anyway. The hat considered this, you're brave in the specific way of someone who has decided that fear isn't useful information and has largely stopped producing it. A longer pause. That's a different and more interesting kind of brave. You do well in Gryffindor. You do well anywhere, frankly, which is unusual. Then put me where I'll do the most good, Harry thought. That's an interesting way to phrase it, the hat said. Most students say where they want to be. You said where you'll do the most good. I know where I want to be. I want to be wherever I can best understand the structure of this world and operate in it effectively. That could be any house. It could, the hat agreed. But some houses give you particular access to particular things. Gryffindor gives you proximity to the people who'll run the resistance, if there's another war. Slytherin gives you proximity to the people who'll run the other side. Ravenclaw gives you the scholars and the thinkers. Hufflepuff gives you everyone who's going to build the actual world when the fighting's done. What would you choose? Harry asked. The hat made a sound that was almost a laugh. Students don't usually turn it around like that. I'm curious what 1,000 years of experience has concluded. A moment of real consideration. Gryffindor, the hat said. Because the war's coming and the people who'll matter most in it will be lions, and you need to know them the way you know your own house. And because, a slight pause, you're your mother's son. She was a Gryffindor too. Harry hadn't known that. He sat with the knowledge for a brief, bright moment. Gryffindor, he agreed. Gryffindor, the hat announced. The Gryffindor table erupted. A proper eruption, the red and gold section standing, the older students banging the tables, someone in the back actually cheering. Harry took off the hat and handed it to Professor McGonagall, whose expression was controlled and precise, but there was something in her eyes that was not professionally neutral at all. He sat down at the Gryffindor table between an ecstatic Ron Weasley and a set of identical twins who introduced themselves as Fred and George with the coordinated ease of people who had spent their entire lives as a unit. They looked at Harry with matching expressions of bright calculation. Harry Potter, Fred said, in the tone of a man finding treasure. Living in Gringotts, George continued, in the same tone. We have questions, Fred said. We have many questions, George agreed. I have an owl, Harry said, and she bites, and she will deliver messages both ways. We have time. They grinned, both of them, the wide synchronized grin of people who had just decided something, and Ron leaned over and said quietly, "You've just made friends with the two most dangerous people in this school, you know." "I know," Harry said. Across the hall, at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was watching him with those sharp, careful eyes. When Harry glanced over, Draco didn't look away. He held Harry's gaze for a moment, not hostility, something more complicated, and then deliberately turned to speak to the boy next to him, which was itself a statement. "I'm watching. I haven't decided yet." Harry turned back to the feast, which had appeared with the kind of abundance that suggested Hogwarts understood the relationship between food and belonging, and helped himself to something that wasn't the careful rationed portions of a cupboard or even the functional meals of the Gringotts kitchens. He was, it turned out, quite hungry. The weeks found their rhythm. Defense against the dark arts was interesting in the specific way of a class taught by someone who clearly had a problem they were managing simultaneously with the teaching. Professor Quirrell's stutter was real and wasn't, which Harry identified in the first class with the same sense that had caught the ward perturbation on Vault 341. Something in the stutter was genuine, a social anxiety that had calcified into habit. But something else in it was also a performance that Quirrell had layered on top of the original until he could no longer entirely tell the difference. Harry sat in the back of the defense classroom and watched and said very little, which Quirrell apparently found comfortable in a way that other attentive students didn't, because an attentive student was just someone learning. Harry watching had a different quality. Transfiguration was Professor McGonagall, who was exactly what her posture had always promised, brilliant, uncompromising, and quietly delighted when students rose to her actual standards rather than her stated ones. Harry turned his matchstick into a needle in 6 minutes, which caused her eyebrow to rise approximately 1 millimeter, which he was fairly certain was the equivalent of a standing ovation from McGonagall. Charms was Professor Flitwick, who was enthusiastic and small and technically rigorous in a way that Harry genuinely appreciated. The magic of incantations and wand movements was different from Karuk in structure but rhymed with it in principle, both were about the precise alignment of intent with action, both rewarded accuracy over force. He was good at the magic. Better than he expected, actually. His wand felt like it was completing circuits rather than generating effects, everything smooth and quick and sharper than he had any first-year right to be. Grimtooth had theorized that his mother's Karuk inheritance had created a foundation that wand magic built on naturally, the way a building with good bones could be extended more easily than one without. He was also better than Hermione Granger at practical spell work, which delighted him for reasons he was certain would confuse her if he tried to explain them. Not competitively, it just felt like the universe being appropriately tidy. Hermione was better than him at almost everything else, which he considered the balance. "You're doing the wrist movement wrong," she told him after the third charms class, with the directness of someone who had concluded that honesty was more efficient than diplomacy. "I know," Harry said. "I'm compensating for it with the verbal emphasis. The effect is the same." She considered this with her head tilted. "That's technically incorrect technique. The charm worked perfectly." "Yes, but," she stopped, rerouted, "if you compensate from the start you'll have to unlearn it later when the spells get more complex." Harry corrected his wrist movement. She looked vindicated. He felt it was a reasonable exchange. Their friendship had the quality of two people who had independently arrived at the conclusion that most human interaction was imprecise and were relieved to find someone else who found this annoying. They argued constantly, not angrily, rigorously, about everything from magical theory to the organizational deficiencies of Flourish and Blots to whether Binza's history of magic class contained any actual history or was simply a list of goblin rebellions that had been stripped of everything that would explain why they happened. He taught the third rebellion with zero context about the Accord of 1752, Harry said, one evening in the library. You can't understand why goblins rebelled without understanding what they'd been promised and hadn't received. It's like describing a contract dispute without mentioning the contract. Hermione looked at him over her book. You're going to correct him, aren't you? I'm going to ask a question that will require him to either provide the context or reveal that he doesn't have it. That's the same thing. The motive is different. Harry. I'm curious about the context, he said, which was true and was also not the whole truth, and they both knew it. She went back to her book. Do it gently. He's a ghost. You can't actually embarrass a ghost, but you can make the class uncomfortable. I will be the soul of tact, Harry said, and when she didn't respond to this, added, that was slightly ironic. I know, she said. I was choosing not to encourage it. Potions was Snape. Harry had known about Severus Snape from the documentation, the spy, the Death Eater turned double agent, the man who had delivered Trelawney's prophecy to Voldemort and then spent the rest of his life apparently trying to compensate for it. Complex, capable, and by all accounts deeply unpleasant to anyone he decided to take a disliking to. He walked into the first potions class and sat down and watched Snape perform his entrance, the sweep of the robes, the voice like something pulled from deep water, the deliberate staging of the dungeons as a psychological environment, and thought, this man understands presentation as power, and he's working very hard to be frightening because frightening keeps people at a distance, and keeping people at a distance is currently all that's keeping him functional. Potter, Snape said, and his voice had a specific quality when he said it, the quality of something anticipated and pre-waited. Our new celebrity. Harry looked at him. The class was quiet with the specific silence of people hoping not to be noticed. Tell me, Potter, Snape continued, prowling toward the front of the room with the particular energy of someone looking for a place to put something sharp, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Draught of living death, Harry said. One of the most potent sleeping draughts known. The asphodel's soporific properties combine with the wormwood's ability to cross magical resistance barriers. The difficulty is the proportions, too much asphodel and you get permanent suspension, not temporary, and the antidote becomes functionally useless. A silence of a different quality. Snape had stopped walking. His expression had the look of a prepared question that had received an unexpected answer and was now recalculating its approach. Where would you look, Snape said, slower now, if I asked you to find me a bezoar? Stomach of a goat, Harry said. Though there's variance in potency by species, Persian goat bezoars are regarded as the most effective for poison antidotes, which is why they're nearly 3 times the price at most apothecaries. The Gringotts Apothecary Stock Audit does a quarterly analysis of, the Gringotts what, Snape said flatly. I grew up in Gringotts, Harry said. We audited everything. Including inventory. Another silence. Snape looked at him with eyes that were doing something complicated, the prepared antagonism had been interrupted by something that was clearly, against its will, intellectual interest. Here was a student who had not memorized the textbook answers. Here was a student who had connected potion ingredients to supply chains and pricing and regional variation, which was frankly a more sophisticated understanding of ingredients than most 7th years managed. He was not pleased about this. That was visible. He had prepared a Potter who could be condescended to, and he'd gotten something he wasn't sure what to do with. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, clipped and flat, as though the words tasted bad. Do not assume this makes you exceptional. The practical application of theory is where most competent-sounding students reveal their limitations. He moved to the front of the room. Take out your books. Ron, sitting next to Harry, leaned over and whispered with barely concealed delight, he's going to absolutely hate you. He's going to respect me eventually, Harry said quietly. The hate comes first. You can't know that, Ron said. I know what it looks like when someone's pretending they're not interested. Harry opened his book. He'll come around. Give it a year. The thing on the back of Quirrell's head Harry became certain of by October. It started with the Kuruk sense, the same wrongness as the Vault Ward, but organic, living, present in the defense classroom like a second heartbeat underneath Quirrell's own. Dark, dense, very old. Not the old of a library or a stone building. The old of something that had refused to be over. He thought about it systematically, the way he thought about everything, and what he arrived at was this: Voldemort, returned to some partial state, was currently occupying Professor Quirrell's head, which was both more interesting and more immediately practical than any first-year curriculum problem he'd encountered. He took this to Hermione on a Tuesday in late October. She stared at him. "You think," she said very carefully, "that you know who is literally living on the back of Quirrell's head?" "I'm certain of it," Harry said. "The Kuruk sense doesn't produce false positives. There's something there that isn't Quirrell, and it's old and dark and fits the description of a severely diminished dark entity." "Kuruk," Hermione said. "The goblin magic I grew up with. Reading weight and worth and presence. I know what a healthy vault feels like and I know what a corrupted one feels like, and Quirrell feels like a corrupted vault." She was quiet for a moment, processing rapidly. He could almost watch her cross-referencing. "The third-floor corridor," she said. "Yes. The thing Gringotts removed from Vault 713 over the summer." She looked at him sharply. "You know about that. Gornick mentioned it. Highly unusual request, ministry adjacent, high security item moved at Dumbledore's request." He paused. "Philosopher's Stone is the most logical conclusion. The only object of sufficient significance to justify that level of security movement. The stone is here," Hermione said flatly. "In the school. Voldemort is also here," Harry said. "Apparently attracted to the same location. Which is either a coincidence or was arranged." "Dumbledore," Hermione said, very quietly. "The trap is the stone," Harry said. "Voldemort is expected to try for it, and the security is meant to be enough to stop him while Dumbledore is available to intervene. Except the security isn't designed to stop a teacher who already has legitimate access," Hermione finished. "Right." They sat with this for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Harry thought about Quirrell in the defense classroom, stuttering through a lesson on dark creatures, Voldemort riding him like a shadow. He thought about what it would mean to Quirrell to be carrying that, the weight of it, the corruption, the way something ancient and dark could settle into a person and rearrange them around itself. He thought about what Grimtooth had said about Kuruk. Everything has worth. Even corrupted things had worth once, before the corruption. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do with a corrupted account is close it cleanly. "I'm going to deal with it," Harry said. "Before it goes any further." Hermione looked at him. "Deal with it how?" "You're 11. Almost 12, Harry said. "Harry. I'm not going to fight Quirrell in the corridor," he said patiently. "I'm going to think about the actual problem, which is not Quirrell but what's on him. Voldemort is in a severely diminished state. He requires a host body and hasn't managed to restore himself in a decade. The stone is his best current option, which means the stone is leverage." He paused. "The question is whether you deal with the immediate threat or the systemic one." "And?" "Both," Harry said. "Simultaneously." He went to see Quirrell on a Wednesday evening in November, the session scheduled as extra defense tutoring, which Quirrell had offered to several students and which Harry had now taken him up on. He sat across the desk from Quirrell and looked at the man, the real man, the anxious academic under the theater of the turban and the stutter, and thought about what this had cost him. Quirrell hadn't been born dark. He'd been weak, and something dark had found that weakness and moved in, and now he was being consumed from the inside by something that had killed over 100 people and intended to continue. "You wanted to discuss defensive counter-theory," Quirrell said, and his stutter had a particular quality in this room, this private room, with no audience. It was less committed. Like a habit that required witnesses to maintain its consistency. "Professor," Harry said, "I know what's on the back of your head." The room changed. Not physically, the temperature stayed the same, the candles kept burning, the desk kept its dimensions. But the quality of the air shifted the way air shifted in a vault when something ancient in it recognized that it was being addressed. Quirrell went very still. And then the stutter, and the nervous manner, and the persona of the anxious professor, simply, dropped. Not slowly. All at once, like a coat falling from a hook. He sat straight in his chair and his eyes had a different quality and his voice, when he spoke, was his own. "How?" he said. "I grew up learning to read what's in a room," Harry said. "What's in this room has a weight I can feel across a classroom. I've been certain since October." A silence. Then, from the back of the turban, a sound like breath through dead leaves, "Yes. I wondered when you would come, Potter." Harry looked at the turban. Then back at Quirrell. "How long have you been? Were you aware when you agreed to this?" Something moved in Quirrell's face. "At first," he said, and it had the quality of a confession. "At first I thought that I could manage it. Control the situation. I went looking for him. I thought if I could bring him back I would be," he stopped. "Significant," Harry said. Quirrell's jaw tightened. "I understand that," Harry said, which appeared to confuse Quirrell considerably. "Touching," said the voice from the turban, and it was all contempt. "Save the sentiment. You have come because you want something, Potter. Everyone who seeks me out wants something. I came because the situation needs addressing," Harry said. "You are currently attached to a host who isn't strong enough to sustain you, pursuing an object that you believe will restore you, in a school full of children. This will not end the way you expect." "And how," the voice said, very soft, very cold, "does it end?" "You get weaker," Harry said. Quirrell fails. You detach, scatter further, find another host or don't. You spend the next decade in progressively more desperate attempts to reconstitute yourself using progressively more dangerous methods, each one making you less of what you were and more of something else." He paused. "Or someone ends it here." "You think you can end it," the voice said. "A child." "I'm the only one who can," Harry said, not with pride, with the flat accuracy of someone stating a mathematical fact. "The wand. The blood. The old magic my mother put in me. You know what you felt when you tried to kill me. You remember what it felt like to touch something you couldn't be near." He held Quirrell's gaze. "Your best option, your only good option, is to detach from Quirrell voluntarily, before the situation degrades to the point where the only resolution is catastrophic." A long silence. Quirrell was shaking slightly. Not with fear, with the effort of maintaining coherence while something dark and old ran through him and was being confronted by something it had very bad associations with. "You cannot force me," the voice said. "No," Harry said. "I can't force you. I can make the alternative clear." He stood. "Quirrell, the offer extends to you as well. Tell Dumbledore. Get help. Whatever this has cost you, staying in it will cost more." He moved to the door. "Potter." He turned. "You are not," the voice said, slowly, with the quality of something arriving at a conclusion against its will, "what I expected." "No," Harry said. "I'm not." He left. 3 days later, Professor Quirrell turned himself in to Dumbledore. Harry wasn't present for that conversation, but he heard the aftermath in the way Hogwarts always transmitted its major events, through the ambient current of student conversation, through McGonagall's expression at breakfast the following morning, through the particular energy of a crisis that had been contained before it became catastrophic. Quirrell was removed from the school. A visiting healer arrived and spent 2 days in the hospital wing. The third-floor corridor was quietly reorganized. Dumbledore found Harry in the library on a Thursday evening, which was where Harry usually was on Thursday evenings. "You knew," Dumbledore said, sitting down across from him without asking, which Harry noted as a change from their first meeting. "Yes," Harry said. "And you confronted Quirinus yourself." It wasn't quite disapproval. It was the tone of someone recalibrating. "I presented him with a clear picture of his options," Harry said. "He made a choice. I think that matters, that he was given a choice rather than just being removed." Dumbledore looked at him. There was something in his expression that Harry was beginning to recognize, the look of a man who had expected a very specific game and kept finding that the pieces moved differently than he'd planned. "Tom Riddle was in that room with you," Dumbledore said. "Yes. You were not afraid. He's attached to a diminished host, without a body, without stable power, without the stone. The threat calculus wasn't what he wanted me to think it was." Harry paused. Being frightened of the idea of him is different from being frightened of the actual current version of him. "And if he had tried to, he didn't," Harry said. "He's not stupid. He knew what my mother's protection would do to him if he tried to use Quirrell to touch me. He had enough sense left to see that the confrontation he wanted wasn't the one available." Dumbledore folded his hands on the table and looked at Harry for a long moment. "What you did," he said finally, "was brave and strategically sound, and I will be honest with you, it made me feel my age." He paused. "I had intended for the stone to serve as a lure, as you likely deduced." "Yes. And you removed the need for the lure." "The lure would have worked," Harry said. "But the collateral damage in a school full of children seemed disproportionate to the strategic gain, especially when a conversation could accomplish most of the same result." He closed his book. "He's weakened further now. Detaching from Quirrell cost him. The next attempt at restoration will be delayed. Years, I think," Dumbledore said quietly. "The disruption to his current form is significant." "Good," Harry said simply. "That gives us time." "For what?" Dumbledore asked. "To be ready," Harry said. "Properly ready. Not just strong enough to survive an encounter in a school corridor, but ready for the actual end of it." He looked at Dumbledore. "I'll need information. About the Horcruxes." The words sat between them. Dumbledore went very still. "How?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "Voldemort split his soul," Harry said. "That's the only explanation that fits the evidence: his ability to survive killing curses, his capacity to persist without a body, the specific magical signature of the dark entity on Quirrell that had the quality of a piece rather than a whole. Something incomplete that knows it's incomplete." He paused. "How many pieces?" A long silence. "I don't know yet," Dumbledore said. "I have suspicions." "Then we both have work to do," Harry said. "When you know, tell me." He picked up his book. "I'll tell you what I find from my end." Dumbledore stood, and at the door he stopped, and when he turned back his expression was something Harry hadn't seen on him before, genuine, unperformed, the face of a very old man who was also, possibly for the first time in a while, a little relieved. "You are the most extraordinary student I have encountered in 50 years of this position," Dumbledore said. "I had good teachers," Harry said. "You had exceptional ones," Dumbledore agreed, and left. At the Ravenclaw table across the library, Hermione looked up from where she'd been reading with what she hoped was plausible innocence. "I wasn't listening," she said. "You were absolutely listening," Harry said. "I heard some of it," she conceded. She looked at him carefully. "Horcruxes?" "Yes." "How many?" "He doesn't know yet." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, we should start a research file." "I already started one," Harry said. She looked briefly annoyed and then decided that the file existing was more important than who started it. "Can I contribute?" "I've been waiting for you to offer," Harry said, and she smiled the wide-reaching up smile and pulled her chair around to his side of the table, and they got to work. Christmas came with the particular quality of a first Christmas somewhere that was becoming real. Harry stayed at Hogwarts, Ron stayed too, and two of the Weasley twins, and a scattering of other students, and the castle in winter had a different character, quieter, more itself. He went home to Gringotts for the holiday week. Grimtooth gave him a new exercise to work on, which was the same as always and felt like a hug, which was not something he would ever say out loud. Ragnarok produced the access authorization for Vault 92 on the second day, and they went down together, Harry, Ragnarok, and Gornik, in the cart to the deep vault levels, and the door opened to the air combination, and Harry walked into the ancestral vault for the first time. It was the weight of it that struck him first. Not the visual, the rows of heirlooms, the property documents, the sealed cases of rare magical texts, the chests of old currency. The weight. Centuries of accumulated intent, accumulated choice, accumulated love and protection and sometimes fear, all of it compressed into this stone room and present to his Kuruk sense the way a very deep chord was present to a trained ear. He stood in the middle of it and breathed. Ragnarok stood at the door and watched him in silence. This was the thing Harry had come to understand most deeply about Ragnarok over 5 years, he didn't fill silences. He let things happen without narrating them, which was the most respectful thing you could do for a person who was having a real moment. On a shelf in the back, in a case that looked simple from the outside but had wards on it that Harry could feel at 10 paces, there were 2 objects. He walked to them and looked through the case without touching. A cloak, folded, that had the quality of something that wasn't quite fully present in the room. It lay there and also somehow didn't lie there, existing slightly sideways from ordinary reality. A small sealed letter beside it, addressed in what he was beginning to know as his father's handwriting, for Harry, when he's ready. He turned to Ragnarok. The cloak, Harry said. Invisibility, Ragnarok said. One of the 3 deathly hallows. It was in your father's possession. It was left out of Dumbledore's stewardship agreement, deliberately, we believe, though whether your father was aware of the full significance, he paused. There are things about that cloak that go beyond its function as a concealment device. I know, Harry said. Grimtooth had covered the Hallows theory in his 3rd year. The weight of the cloak was unmistakable. This was not an ordinary artifact. I'm not going to use it to hide, he said. When I take it. I didn't imagine you would, Ragnarok said. Harry turned back to the case. He looked at his father's letter. I think, he said, I'll read this one here. Ragnarok and Gornik stepped back to the vault entrance, not leaving, just giving him the room. Harry opened the case with the heir authentication, the Kuruk sense confirming the match, and took out his father's letter. Harry, if Lily's reading this to you, I'm in trouble. If you're reading it yourself, I'm in bigger trouble. Either way, hi. Harry laughed, out loud, alone in the vault, startled by it. A genuine laugh. The cloak has been in our family for so long we stopped questioning it. I think your grandfather's grandfather thought it was just a very good cloak. Then I married your mother, and she spent 3 weeks in the library and came out looking the way she looked when she knew something nobody else did, and said, James, this is one of the Hallows. So. That's a thing. I don't have a lot of wisdom to offer about how to use it, because I was 21 when I wrote this and more brave than sensible, which your mother will confirm if she's also reading this. But here's what I know, the cloak isn't about hiding. It never was. The story says death gave it as a gift, but the real gift isn't invisibility. It's the choice of when to be seen and when not to be. That's power of a kind most people never think about. We love you. We're proud of you. Be good, be stubborn, be your mother's son and occasionally your father's. James Harry read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his inside pocket next to his mother's letter. Then he took the cloak from the case, which settled in his hands with the weight of something that had always been going to end up there. He put it back, not using it yet, just completing the acknowledgement of its presence, and turned back to the vault. He looked at his parents' accumulated life in the old stone room, all the things they'd intended and built and left, and he felt the weight of it in the Kuruk sense as something fully present, fully real, fully his. He turned to Ragnarok at the door. I'm ready, he said. Not for any specific thing. For all of it. Ragnarok looked at him with those still dark eyes, and something moved in his face that Harry had spent 5 years learning to read, the thing goblins felt instead of what humans called pride, which was bigger and quieter and more like the specific satisfaction of a very long, very careful piece of work arriving at the right conclusion. Yes, Ragnarok said. You are.